Hey, what's going on, you guys, man? I'm back with another reaction for you all and thing, you know what I mean? And someone says, hey, Mr. Giant, where's the next part of the Troubles? So here it is, the Troubles, 1972, 1986, a bloody war on British streets. You know what I mean? And I kind of remember that whole scenario a little bit. I followed that some when I was back on the island, and that was really making the news and stuff like that. So, I kind of know a little bit about it, but I'm going to get into the details right now, okay? Let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer and learn some stuff about what the troubles really were in Ireland.
On the afternoon of the 30th of January 1972, a civil rights march passed through the streets of Derry, Londonderry. The protesters, around 50,000 strong, tried to move towards the city centre.
Before this can really go in, it's really strange, especially when you live in this side of the world. When you hear civil rights, you think of the 1960s with the African Americans. And then you hear about civil rights and the marches and stuff in Ireland, as you could see here from the Troubles, it sort of makes make a bell go off in your head to the point to where we're not all that different. We have those struggles at some point in our history, and everybody does, be it the British, be it the Irish, be it the Africans, the Caribbean folks, be it the Americans, black and white, because we know there was some discrimination against Irish when they come here, there's discrimination against Jewish people. So at some point, there have been people that have had to fight against that oppression. And but we get so engrossed in our own struggles that we don't realize that other people, and I'm talking about just ordinary people, then we don't pay attention to the fact that other people are having civil rights struggles too, because we get so tunnel vision into our own struggle and we're not trying to understand other people's struggle. Now, I remember back in the 70s, whenever other nationalities or groups have struggles, we would pay attention to it. But it seems like we have gotten to be this so singular minded in these modern times that all we do is pay attention to our struggle, and a lot of people wear their struggle as a badge of honor, or as a manipulation tool to get what they want. And in a way, that sort of hampers the progression of making progress from that struggle. We got to understand all of us. And that would be scary for those who are in power and want us to be against each other. You know what I'm saying? Let's get back to this.
Blocked by the British Army. Though most of the crowd moved on to the bogside, a no-go area for British forces, others began to throw stones at the soldiers. And soon afterwards, troops of the parachute regiment were then ordered to move into the bogside and begin arresting the crowd.
Over the next half an hour, one para would open fire on the demonstrators, leaving 26 injured and killing 13. A 14th man would die several months later.
See, that's another thing too. He used the term demonstrators. Right here now in this country, they just use the word rioters. They don't call them demonstrators. Now, at the same time, Ireland was going through this, my country was going through the same thing. And the terms I'm hearing here is what was used on the island at the same time, demonstrators, you know what I mean? People throwing rocks at the police and stuff like that. So our histories were sort of aligned, sort of there. Let's get going.
This Humber pig here, IWM London, was on strength with one para at the time of Bloody Sunday. We don't actually know if it was actually there on the day, but it certainly was one of their vehicles. Bloody Sunday was probably the most famous or infamous instance of the Troubles. However, it was just one of many terrible incidents in what became...
Stopping again, sorry. We have something called a Bloody Sunday too on the island. We also have a Bloody Monday, but we have a Bloody Sunday too.
...the bloodiest year of the Troubles.
In the first episode of our Trouble series, we explored the origins of the conflict. And now, with the British Army deployed, a deadly multi-sided war began to be waged on Northern Irish streets. The violence would cost thousands of lives, mostly civilian. But within the violence, all the sides were beginning to change. By the 1980s, they would adopt new strategies that would shape the future of Northern Ireland. The events of Bloody Sunday were a source of outrage around the world. 3 days later, the British Embassy in Dublin was burnt to the ground by protesters incensed by the killings. As the violence grew, the British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, felt he had no choice but to suspend the Northern Irish Parliament at Stormont and impose direct rule from Westminster. This was intended as a short-term measure, but for the Provisional IRA, it was exactly what they wanted.
The IRA felt quite triumphant at the time. They wanted Britain drawn further into the conflict. They could then frame the narrative more as they wished to see it. The IRA in 72 were operating using the car bomb, a relatively indiscriminate form of weaponry, as well as open confrontation with the army. However, the way the IRA operated would change in a matter of a few years, and they would reorganise themselves and settle themselves in for what they knew would be a much longer struggle.
The violence continued to intensify throughout the rest of 1972. In response to Bloody Sunday, the official IRA bombed the HQ of the Parachute Regiment in Aldershot, but only killed civilians. The backlash from this and other elements of their campaign led them to declare a ceasefire soon afterwards. From that point onwards, the Provisional IRA became the majority faction in the Republican movement. In July, they enacted their own reprisal for Bloody Sunday, detonating 22 bombs across Belfast in what became known as Bloody Friday. 9 people were killed and around 130 injured in the space of just 75 minutes. In response, the British Army began Operation Motorman, their biggest operation since Suez. Over 30,000 troops, assisted by tanks, went into clear no-go areas controlled by Republican paramilitaries.
During Operation Motorman, British troops would crash through these impromptu barriers and vehicles like the Humber Pig. For soldiers, it was highly protective, but to civilians, it would have seemed an oppressive and frightening tool. As far as trying to catch the people involved, largely the Republican paramilitaries had got away. However, the British were laying down a marker. They were prepared to use force to clear these areas, and there was no place they felt they couldn't go. On top of this, in an attempt to clamp down on the violence, the British also sought to introduce a method that would get round the intimidation of jurors and witnesses through what were known as diplock courts.
I tell you, man, with the soldiers coming down in those armored vehicles chasing those people, that brought back memories of running from the police. And it's not like criminal act, and I wasn't really part of the demonstration. Curiosity kills the cat, they said. So what I used to do is, like, I used to go out there and just to see what they're doing. You know what I mean? I wasn't holding a sign. I was young, you know, so I wasn't holding a sign. I just wanted to see what the action was. But when the action took off, and we have the secret police and other police coming at us, running back to the house and thing, you know, and being chased by policemen and all of that. I just bring back just a flashback there for me, you know. That was in the 70s too on the island. You understand what I'm saying? Thing. Yeah, that was some scary times, but sort of adrenaline pumping times.
Where a sole judge would sit and would try the accused without any witnesses and without any jury. This was seen as an effective method to get round any form of intimidation.
The Republican anger at this latest British intervention was palpable, and as 1972 came to an end, the Provisional IRA were set to attack the UK mainland for the first time.
What?
On Thursday, the 8th of March 1973, Provisional IRA bombs exploded at the Old Bailey and in Whitehall in London.
Wow.
The attacks claimed 1 life and injured over 240. It was the beginning of a new phase of the Troubles. On May 17, 1974, the UVF detonated 4 car bombs in Dublin and Monaghan in the Republic of Ireland. 33 people and 1 unborn child were killed.
Wow.
The deadliest attack of of the Troubles. But at the same time, diplomatic efforts were beginning to emerge. A new Northern Irish Assembly was founded in 1973, made up of moderate parties from all sides. They approved the Sunningdale Agreement, a power-sharing executive with involvement from the Republic of Ireland. At the time, it truly seemed like the beginnings of peace in the conflict, but it was not to be. In May, the Ulster Workers' Council called a general strike and forced the loyalist leader of the executive to resign, and soon afterwards, the agreement collapsed. The pattern of violence had been set, and extremists on both sides now held enough sway to derail any peace attempt. For the British government, the failure of Sunningdale left some in doubt over Britain's future in Northern Ireland, but peace attempts continued nonetheless. Backdoor negotiations had begun in 1972, but towards the end of 1974, they began to bear fruit. The ban on the IRA's political wing, Sinn Féin, was lifted, and plans for a ceasefire were agreed. In September 1975, the Provisional IRA declared an indefinite truce.
The Provisional IRA had hoped for Britain to actually lay out a sort of map of when they intended to withdraw, and also at some point declare a date. This never happened. They also suspected, and actually were quite correct, that the British government had been using the lapse in the violence to basically gather intelligence and also spread dissent and split them. With this in effect, the ceasefire pretty much petered out long before it was officially declared over.
As violence returned, there were fears on the loyalist side that the negotiations were merely a precursor to a full British withdrawal from Northern Ireland. Loyalist paramilitaries therefore attempted to draw the Provisional IRA away from the ceasefire and back into the fight. What transpired were a series of sectarian tit-for-tat killings, Loyalists targeting Catholics and, in revenge, Republicans targeting Protestants. It was some of the most sickening violence of the conflict.
This is Sterling submachine gun. It's a British Army issue that had been around since the end of the Second World War period. It was sold to armies all around the world and was a reliable weapon. This weapon itself was taken by the Royal Ulster Constabulary in 1980. As we can see from the tab, it was captured from Loyalist paramilitaries. Loyalist paramilitaries would also have seen the fall of Stormont and direct rule coming from London, and perhaps the future in Northern Ireland as they saw it being in doubt. In this
Hey, I don't know if it's me or what, but that was an ugly looking gun. Deadly, apparently, but that was an ugly looking gun.
period of the early 1970s, both Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries engaged in bloody tit-for-tat struggles, revenge attacks, in which very often civilians were caught up in the middle of.
By 1976, the ceasefire had broken down completely. Political peace had failed, and back-channel negotiations had led to nothing. Now, all sides settled into new strategies, which, in the coming years, would change the shape of the conflict. After the
No, the question is, and this is a general question. When it becomes that tit for tat and revenge killing, is the cause forgotten in it, or are people just being rallied by the revenge part of it? Comment down below, what do you think? Because I'm looking at it from a human perspective here, you know what I mean? Because, we could say we believe in something and we're fighting for it, but once the battle starts, are you really fighting for that? Or are you fighting for survival or for revenge? You know what I mean? Like during the Iraq War, certain soldiers were prosecuted because they just went in there and shoot up villages. And I know it happened during the Vietnam War, and it has to have happened in all kinds of wars. So is it fighting for the cause, or is the cause just something in the back of the mind at that point? Once again, taking into consideration human emotion.
failed ceasefire, the provisional movement came under new leadership from younger members like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. To them, it was clear that the British would not be leaving Northern Ireland anytime soon, and so they set out a new strategy for what they called a long war. Receiving new arms and supplies from Libya and the USA, they planned a war of attrition against the British Army, centralising command and using smaller cells known as active service units.
Okay, now that's new for me there. I didn't know Libya and the USA give them arms. So two countries that end up being mortal enemies was helping the Irish people. Now, did they give them the arms or did they buy the arms? Because we all know that that stuff is big money, big industry. You know, that's why we always have wars, because there's always guns to be sold, ammunition to be sold, warfare to be sold. You know what I'm saying?
This is the Armalite AR-18 rifle. It's American, made by the Armalite company in California. Interestingly, they were never ever used by any of the world's armies, although they were used by police forces. But they were also, significantly in this case, used by Provisional IRA, and a number of these were received in from the United States. And it became a sort of symbol of IRA resistance. Indeed, Sinn Féin in their 1981 conference talked about taking power with the Armalite in one hand and the ballot box in the other. And the Armalite is this particular weapon here, the AR-18.
But the British government was changing strategy too. Having failed to end the violence for coming up for a decade, they now aim to limit the conflict and its effects to Northern Ireland, launching a three-part strategy named Ulsterisation, Criminalisation and Normalisation. The British Army began to hand over control to the local forces of the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the Ulster Defence Regiment.
The new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Roy Mason, took a much harder line with paramilitaries. They started to talk of the IRA as mafia-style gangs headed up by godfathers. They reframed them as being criminals rather than revolutionaries or political activists. One of the biggest changes they made was...
See, same thing here. Black Lives Matter people, you know, the idea was for the respecting of black lives, black people. And of course they frame it, oh, they're rioters, they're hooligans, they're thugs, you know, understand what I mean? Which sort of overshadows the real reason why this movement was formed. And that's not just it. I remember Occupy Wall Street was a big movement when people were like, man, these rich people are terrorizing us, you know what I mean? We got to do something. So people decide to occupy Wall Street. In that case, what they did is they commercialized the phrase occupy. Because people would say stuff like, I'm going to occupy this pizza. You know what I mean? I'm going to occupy this soccer game. You know, I'm going to occupy this movie, you know, meaning they're going to sit and watch a movie, you know. You know, I'm going to occupy this girl, which means they're going to go date a girl. I mean, they were using it, for lack of a better term, they bastardized the phrase until it became so watered down and commercialized that it didn't mean anything anymore. It became a joke. You know what I mean? The same corporations that they were fighting against used their own phrase against them. That stuff works like a charm.
Was the end of special category status for prisoners convicted of terrorist offences after the 1st of March 1976. No longer now would prisoners be able to fraternise with their own colleagues, wear their own clothes, or not take part in prison work as what you would have called an ordinary, decent criminal. This important decision would have ramifications inside the prisons in years to come.
The decision led to a series of protests by paramilitary prisoners inside the Maze prison. In 1976, they began the blanket protest, refusing to wear prison uniforms. Then in 1978, they began the dirty protests, or the no-wash protests, smearing their excrement on the walls of their cells. But things escalated further when, in March of 1980, special category status was ended for all prisoners, regardless of when their crimes were committed. Now, Maze prisoners began a hunger strike. The first attempt was controversially called off when it seemed that the British government was about to give in. But when they didn't, IRA man Bobby Sands led a second hunger strike in March of 1981, a decision which would change the course of the Troubles.
The 1981 hunger strike had a massive impact on the public, particularly in Northern Ireland, but also around the world as well. What was seen was men being allowed to die within the prison, and it appeared the British government was unwilling to do anything to stop it. Such was the fame of people like Bobby Sands at the time, the idea was put forward to stand him as an MP for the vacant Fermanagh and South Tyrone seat. And to the surprise of many, Bobby Sands won the election. This sent out a message really to Sinn Féin that they could be more active within the political field, and they could certainly be successful if they stood candidates, even if they didn't choose to take the seats that they'd actually won. And certainly from 1981 through to 84-85, Sinn Féin were relatively successful in elections, both in Northern Ireland and also down in the Republic of Ireland.
When Sands died after 66 days without food, he became a martyr for the Republican cause. 100,000 people attended his funeral in Belfast. New members and money now poured into the Provisional IRA, and though the strikes came to an end in October, their impacts were already being felt. In 1982, Sinn Féin finally became a political force in their own right, winning 5 seats in the new Northern Ireland Assembly, though they did not take their seats. Meanwhile, the Republican armed struggle continued. In 1984, they mounted their most audacious attack so far, an attempt on the life of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. They set off a £100 bomb at the Conservative Party conference in Brighton, killing 5, but Thatcher and her husband just escaped injury. Instead, her biggest worry was Sinn Féin's political success, and so in November of 1985, the British and Irish governments came together to sign the Anglo-Irish Agreement, stating that there would be no change in the status of Northern Ireland without the agreement of a majority of its citizens. They also gave the Republic of Ireland's government an advisory role in the north. This was a major blow to loyalists who saw it as a stepping stone towards the united Ireland that they had always feared. In response, loyalist protests toppled the Northern Ireland Assembly, while loyalist paramilitary violence began to grow once again.
Apart from the unionist anger towards the agreement and what it might mean for them, it also made the IRA stop and take stock of what they were doing at this point. They saw how Britain had now moved from being this immovable colonial force to a country who actually could be negotiated with and who could actually change its position. So in 1986, they abandoned the long-held tenet of abstentionism. From now on, any who were elected to power within Sinn Féin would actually take their seats within the Dáil, the Southern Irish Parliament. This is a major break in Republican tradition and shows in many ways how far the Provisional IRA have come since the early 70s.
By the end of 1986, the shape of the Troubles had changed entirely. Sinn Féin had gone from sideshow to genuine political force. Loyalist paramilitaries were on the rise, and the British government was attempting to step away. And yet, after nearly 2 decades of conflict, civilians were still bearing the brunt of the fighting, and the streets of Northern Ireland were no closer to peace. The question was, how much more could the Northern Irish people take?
It's crazy, when these things happen, the people who suffer the most are the civilians. It's like they get caught in the crossfire, and it's just for lack of a better term, emancipation from the whatever oppression they're experiencing. But the cost is high. You know what I'm saying and thing. But okay. I'm gonna have to looking through the struggles in Northern Ireland. Looks like that's another part of it. I'm gonna have to check that one out too. Get me a nice broad understanding of it. You know what I mean? I remember Margaret Thatcher. She was mentioned a lot on the island back in the day, so I remember her. You know what I mean? This is quite interesting. I hope you guys are enjoying watching this with me. And just comment down below. Tell me what you know of this. Those of you who have lived it or have family that have lived it. You know, understand what I say? Those comments are always interesting to me. You understand? I'm gonna leave a link in the description to this video. You know what I mean? So you have to go check this out. You know, on your own time and watch it through without me stopping and babbling all the time. And if you like this video, drop a like on it, share the video with your friends and thing, you know what I mean? The message here is, we need some peace. We need to stop making the same repeating the same old history over and over again. And we also, like from the jump when I said, if we stop for a minute and we pay attention, we will realize that at some point in history, we've all had those kind of struggles. And for those of us who have rise above those struggles, we need to pay attention and realize that we shouldn't do to others what have been done to us. Whoo, that's some kind of biblical there. But anyway, you all take care of each other, all right? Cool runnings.